Good morning, class, and welcome to the feudal system, where the king hires knights to take all your money. The feudal system developed when Charlemagne's empire died, and there were very weak kings who didn't control much territory and didn't even control the people that they thought they controlled, and local noblemen, local warlords took over. Remember, this was a problem that Charlemagne's great grandfather faced, and then his dad faced. Every time a powerful king unites the noblemen, then he dies, it's all split up between the sons or grandsons again. And the kings just could not keep control over a large territory for very long. So throughout the Middle Ages, from about 800 to 900 AD, all the way up to like 1200 AD, you have very local control of the local warlords, the local noblemen. And that is feudalism, where the noblemen are in charge and no one really listens to the king. Local rulers would promise protection to the people underneath them in exchange for them working for them. So, it's a jungle out there. Everyone's attacking their neighbors. There's wars constantly. My army will protect you if you feed and clothe my army. So we see here the flow of goods and services. At the top is the king, but he's only nominally on top. He is the one who actually, you could say, hires the noblemen by giving them their land, and they give him military aid and loyalty in exchange for their land, their fiefdom, and peasants. Then the lords often have several layers of lords underneath them, and at the bottom of that totem pole is the knights. It's the least nobility. The knights obviously fight for the noblemen in their wars, and they pay them homage, which means just loyalty. And in return, they're given, the rest of an army to protect them. They're given a house. They're given food. At the very bottom of the totem pole, you have the peasants or serfs. They farm the land. They pay rent, and in exchange, the army protects them from their neighbors, and they're given a house to live in and food. In the feudal system, land is the basis of all power because the people and the resources go with the land. However much land you own all the people living on that land as well. It's not quite slavery. They're not technically owned by you, but they work for you and aren't allowed to leave. So it's kind of almost slavery. The more land you have, the more villages you own, the more mines and farms and forests you own, the more powerful you are and the bigger army you have. So the king would technically own the entire country all by himself, although he did not have the power like that because no one listened to him. But the king would give land to the nobles, give them their fiefdom, in exchange for their military services. I am giving you this land if you give me your army when I call for it. That piece of land is called a fief, or in Latin feudum, which is where we get the word feudalism. Now, because the army was given by the nobles and raised by the nobles, trained by the nobles, comes from the nobles' land, if there was ever a problem between the king and the noblemen, the army is loyal to the noblemen. So the king has his own private land, his own private fief that he can raise his own private army on, but all the armies in the country are private armies, owned and operated by the noblemen. And you could just imagine how bad that would be for the nation. I mean, imagine if every wealthy person in America owned their own part of the army. And, when we go to war, we're all supposed to work together. But when we're not at war with our, with our enemies overseas, we would all be at war with each other because we want our neighbor's property. Yeah, during the Middle Ages, the person you have to worry about is your neighbor. Almost all the wars are between neighbors, not between nations. The nation was a very loose idea. You might speak the same language as your neighbor. That doesn't mean you're allies. That doesn't mean you have anything in common. You want to go steal their fief. The people underneath the noblemen are called the vassals. A vassal is someone who pays homage and respect and loyalty to the person on top. So most of the rich people were both lords and vassals. So you are a lord over the people underneath you. You are a vassal to the people above you. And there might be many layers of that. And that's called sub-infeudation. So let's say the king gives a bunch of land to this duke. Well, the duke might hire several other people, a count and a baron, and they are lesser nobles underneath him. So the count is loyal to the duke, and the duke is loyal to the king. And then you might go again and again, and probably the count has multiple knights who are technically noblemen, but they are very, very minor noblemen. They have to do all the fighting themselves. Knights would typically be second and third and fourth sons who don't have any land, but they do have the noble blood or the noble title, but no land. So they have to fight for a living. So when there comes time for war, you might, have this count, and these two knights are fighting each other for power. And then when the Duke needs help, the Count calls on the knights to both fight for him and go for them. And by the way, you wouldn't just have a handful of knights. The knights would be the premier fighting force, but each one of these knights might own thousands of serfs. And so you call up a couple hundred of them to fight for you. So you have one knight for every 100 peasants with pitchforks, right? But then all these guys are constantly fighting one another, even though they all constantly owe each other allegiance, and it's just a big, big, big mess. There was a story, I don't think it's in here, but I read a story somewhere about a guy from the Middle Ages trying to figure out all these strings of who's loyal to who. They found out this one guy was sub-infeudated like 15 times. He has like 15 different layers of bosses on top of me, so that's that's kind of ridiculous, but that's the way it is. As we have seen, the basic relationship of the Middle Ages was between the lord and the vassal, and that can mean the king and a very powerful nobleman and a lesser nobleman, or a lower nobleman and the peasants underneath them. You have the lord above and the vassal below. You do a ceremony called homage, which is how you become a vassal to the person above you, except, of course, if you're born into that position, like peasants were born into that position, and they didn't have to do a ceremony because they were just expected to do that. So here is a guy recording this ceremony of homage, where the vassal does an oath of fealty. And here they're holding hands. And you promise to obey and serve the person above you, and then in exchange they give you an investiture, which means they invest you with authority. They officially give you the authority to be their nobleman. Here we go. The Lord guaranteed protection and justice to his vassals. He acted as both the general and the judge. The vassals were responsible for bringing an army to the field when necessary. And when you are given a fief, you are told, okay, this fief has 1,000 people in it. That means 200 fighting men. So whenever I ask, give me 200 fighting men. Vassals were also provided with financial aid on certain occasions. Or sorry, they weren't provided with, they provided. They were the ones who are giving money to the king. Now, taxes back then were not like they are today. Today, taxes come out of your paycheck every time you get a paycheck, every week or every 2 weeks. Back then, taxes were usually a once-a-year thing. Even then, sometimes taxes were sporadic. For instance, there might be a type of tax. I know there was one in England that was a naval tax, and they only raised this tax when they needed to buy new warships in time of war. So this might be a once every 20-year tax. And on those special occasions, the vassals were expected to pay. Here is just a flow chart. The Lord provides an army to protect everyone underneath him, defends them with being a judge and everything, and feeds the people. The people are the army. They provide counsel to those above them. We're not talking peasants here sitting on the council. We're talking about noblemen advising higher noblemen or the king. And then, of course, they're paying food and supplies and money to the Lord, who uses that money to buy weapons and armor and hire soldiers and hire lawyers and all that kind of thing. The castle was the center of life for the nobility, from the Latin castellum, which means fort. The castle is the Lord's home. It's where he lives, and most of the year at least. It is also the jail. You usually have a jail in the basement called a dungeon. And of course, the people have no legal rights, so the noble is the judge, jury, and executioner. He decides everything, and he has a jail in his house. So an awful lot of power from that noble. If you make him mad, you get chucked in jail for a week, a year. Really, they didn't do sentences very often. You were there at the Lord's pleasure, which means you're there until the Lord feels like releasing you. Maybe he's feeling really generous one day. Maybe he gets a really nice Christmas present and he's in a good mood, and one of your buddies can say, hey, can you let him out of jail now? I think he's learned his lesson. Some people are just thrown in jail and forgotten about, years and years and years later. Wait, why is that guy in jail? I forget. It's a court. If you have a problem with someone else, you sue and you ask the nobleman to make the guy give you money or fix the problem. It's also the treasury. There are no banks. So all the money is actually gold and silver coins held in treasure chests. And that treasure chest better be in the most protected place in town. That's going to be in the castle. It's also the armory. Weapons and armor were incredibly expensive, especially the nice ones, the metal stuff, metal swords and spears and arrows. Bows even could be very expensive if they were well crafted, and whole suits of armor. If you have chain mail from head to toe, that would be worth tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. Very painstakingly crafted. And so you better believe the Lord kept a close eye on all those weapons. They didn't really have like gun rights laws back then. Most peasants did not have weapons at home. Of course, they would have like a butcher's knife, maybe a kitchen knife, something like that. Probably a bow and arrow for hunting, although a lot of times the peasants weren't allowed to hunt because that's a noble sport. Yeah, the nobleman might have thousands of swords and spears and things in his castle, and when it's time for war, you just call up the army and give them all a sword. And it's the town center. It's where anything important in town happens. All the social activities are happening at the castle. Here's the most photographed castle in the world, Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, Germany. Really cool castle, but this was built hundreds of years after the Middle Ages. This is not a real castle. This is a fairy tale castle, a make-believe castle from a king who was incredibly rich and wanted to make believe that he lived in a world of knights and castles and shiny armor and dragons. So as you can see, lots and lots of glass windows, and it's really made for luxury, not for defense. But absolutely gorgeous. Here's a castle that's really just made for defense. Rather small, very blocky, at the top of a very steep hill. Good luck trying to attack up there. Here's another one. Notice the round towers. The round towers are there for a reason. If you chuck a rock at it with a catapult, if you have a straight wall, all the energy from the catapult goes right into the wall. If you have a round wall, hopefully it can deflect the shot and deflect some of that energy. So they're actually way stronger than straight walls. Also, straight, square towers have corners, and corners are massive weak spots. And obviously a circle doesn't have a corner. The castle was really not designed for luxury because the nobleman is not really a wealthy person like we would think of today. Now, they probably did not have a lot of luxuries just because there were no luxuries available. And even if you were incredibly rich, there might not be a lot of creature comforts available to you. You might have the best of everything in England, but that's not saying a lot. One of the early types of castles is called a motte and bailey. Motte means mound. So you have this hill, sometimes natural, very often man-made. You often make that hill by digging these giant moats around the town. And where does all that dirt go? All that dirt gets piled up into a hill. Sometimes they just take a natural hill and try to make it as steep as possible, so it's almost impossible to get up to the top. At the top, you have this wooden palisade wall. You have a keep in the middle. Then you have the village down here. Notice there's a drawbridge there. There might be a drawbridge here. And that place is ready to be defended at a moment's notice. Oh, by the way, the mound is the motte. The bailey means this enclosed area. It's a walled town. It's called the bailey. Here is an example of how castles evolved over the years. Every few years, if you had any extra money, extra time on your hands, you would build more defenses. So you might start off with a wooden wall and then end up with something massive like this. Anyone recognize this? This is the Tower of London. This white part is called the White Keep, and that was built by William the Conqueror. It started, well, he attacked in 1066. I think this construction on this began a year or two later, like 1068 or so. But it started off just this one massive building. Then as the years go by, they built more buildings here. These are just functional, they're barracks and things like that. Then you build this giant wall around it. Then decades later, you build an even gianter wall around that. You build this wall. They had a big moat here, and this moat was connected to the Thames River, and it was designed so as the river tide went up and then went out, it would wash away everything in the moat. And that was very important because the moat was used as a garbage dump, and all the toilets emptied out into the moat. Uh, but there was a problem with the construction in that the Thames never once cleaned it. It didn't rise enough, according to their calculations. So that moat was just filled with garbage and waste, and it was absolutely disgusting. So eventually they just filled it up with dirt, and look how bright green that grass is there. Lots of fertilizer there. That's gross. Yeah, but construction on the Tower of London was ongoing for like 1,000 years. Oh, it hasn't quite been 1,000 years yet, but there you go. Almost 1,000 years. But every few decades they just build more and more and more and more and more and more and more until it's like impenetrable. So how does someone go about becoming a knight? At first, anyone could be a knight if you have a horse. And that was the thing. If you own a horse, you could join the military and become a knight. And just having a horse was rather expensive. And so the cavalry were so important to the army that the horsemen were given a lot of respect. So, of course, that's mostly going to be the richer people. They're given a lot of respect just for being able to fight. Later, there were rules about knighthood, and knighthood became like really official, an official club, and only noblemen were allowed to become knights. So typically around age 7, you'd become a page. And a page is like an unpaid intern. It's a little kid who is sent to go help a knight. And he shines the knight's shoes, and he polishes the armor, and he cooks them dinner, and he sweeps and takes out the trash. And he's basically an unpaid servant for the knight. And hopefully, as the years go on, he is learning what it means to be a knight and how to become a knight, almost like being a disciple. You're living with the guy and you're learning everything you can about him. Probably some form of athletic training at this point, maybe even some weapons training. It would have been probably wooden swords, training with other little kids your age. Can you imagine? I mean, Claire is 6. Can you imagine someone just a little older than Claire? We're talking like second, third grade, pretending to be knights and sword fighting and probably horseback riding, learning that from a rather young age. When you become a teenager, you'd graduate to a squire, and a squire had a lot more respect. They weren't just some little twerp in the way. They were a very important part of the knight's life. So they would be the ones in charge of taking care of your horse. And your horse is your life as a knight. They would be the ones, feeding and taking care of them and brushing them down and making sure they get medical attention from the medieval vet, making sure their hooves are all right. They're the ones who have charge of your armor and weapons. So if your armor gets rusty, it's no good, and the squire is the one make sure that happens. The squire also dresses the knight in his armor. Usually you can't put armor on by yourself. It's so big and bulky and has so many little fiddly straps. The squire is the one buckling your armor on. And then often the squire is following you into battle and is your personal bodyguard. So as the knight goes charging into battle, the squire is right there beside him, doing nothing but making sure that the knight is safe. I've heard stories how it is possible to knock an arrow out of the air if you are quick enough, and if the bowman is far away enough, you can see that arrow going, and you could take your sword and thwack it out of the air if you're good enough. So often they would be, beside the guy looking out for arrows, chopping them out of the air. That's pretty crazy. Uh, in the story of Robin Hood, the original story, Friar Tuck has trained three giant mastiffs, big old hunting dogs, to bite arrows out of the air. And I don't know if that's quite possible, but they say in the story it happened. So there you go. The squire would sometimes be a shield bearer, so would have a massive, oversized shield, and would be in charge of stepping in front of the knight with his shield if necessary. If the knight gets injured, breaks a leg, if he gets dismounted, it's the squire's job of bringing him back to safety. Say the knight gets an arrow to the throat or an arrow to the knee or something. If the squire pulls him off. Sometimes the squire would also be mounted if the knight can afford more than one horse. The squire would also be mounted, and if the knight's horse gets killed or injured, the squire hops off and says, "Jump on my horse instead." So yeah, the squire, very, very important. And then when you grow up and you're a full-blown adult, you enter into the ceremony of knighthood and become a knight in your own right. However, some squires were squires for many years, well into their adulthood, so that they could serve a famous knight or a king or a nobleman that would be a squire to them. So often the ceremony of knighthood was a very religious thing. So they would go to the church and they would spend all night in church. They would get like rebaptized and wear white clothes, and they'd have their sword and armor in front of the altar in church, and they just pray all night long. This guy's praying on his knees. One common thing would be lying prostrate, which literally means lying down on the ground, face down on the ground with your arms and legs spread eagle, and your forehead to the ground, just praying all day long or all night long as a sign of submission to God. And then maybe you've heard of the dubbing ceremony, where the person in charge takes a sword and taps your shoulder and say, "I dub thee Sir Mike the Mighty," or whatever. Apparently, this came about, the whole sword tap thing, because there were kings who would pretend to behead you, and as the sword is coming, if you flinched or showed that you were scared, if you showed fear in your eyes, he would actually keep on going and actually behead you. And if you didn't show any fear, he would stop it and not kill you. There was another ceremony in Germany, I believe, where the king would just like punch you full in the face and knock you flat on your back. And if you could take that like a man, then you were a knight now. And then that evolved to just tapping with a sword, which is, much better. Now here is a lady, and maybe you've heard, the whole romantic chivalrous love thing, the courtly love, where you're doing all your fighting for the favor of a beautiful princess. But ladies usually didn't have much political power, so I don't think they had the authority to knight anyone. This is a famous painting of Tristan and Isolde from the King Arthur stories. Weird story. And yes, the knights were the backbone of the Crusades, with crosses on their chests and their shields. God wills it. Knights were expected to live by a code of chivalry, which just comes from the French word for horse. Chevalier is a horseman. They were expected to be brave, physically strong and powerful, honest above everything, and to protect the weak, including the women and the civilians. Remember when I talked about Bushido and the samurai, and how, the samurai were supposed to be all chivalrous, but they probably weren't? That's more of glamorizing the past. Most of what we know about chivalry comes from after the age of knights, and it probably is just a way of glamorizing the past. And I'm not sure if any knights were as chivalrous as they make them out to be. Read the story of King Arthur. Sir Lancelot, super strong, super brave, rushes into battle, 10 against 1, and of course he's so big and powerful that he kills them all and wins. Sir Galahad, always honest and pure and always does the right thing, always protects the weak, rushes in to defend my fair lady. Knights were probably just soldiers, just like any other soldier at any other time of history. Some of them were great guys, and some of them were thugs with swords. Chivalry is not dead. So the Middle Ages could be incredibly brutal, and everyone's attacking their neighbor, and just everyone's dying, and everyone's killing each other, really for no reason, just because the noblemen got in some kind of argument about nothing. Everyone's killing each other, and the Catholic Church said, we gotta get peace in Europe, and this is stupid. So they said, let's expand that idea of chivalry, take it to the next degree, and they passed two laws. Yeah, the church passed two laws called the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The Peace of God said you're not allowed to plunder and pillage on church property, which is actually a big section of Europe. They own a lot of land. You're not allowed to fight on church property. You're also not allowed to kill civilians, and you're not allowed to burn civilian houses down. And that again was a huge help. Then the Truce of God said you're not allowed to fight on Sundays or any holy day. The thing is, every saint had their own holiday back then. There were like 180 holidays. A huge section of the calendar now you're not allowed to fight on. So hopefully that would reduce the number of casualties in Europe. Now, the church cannot always enforce these rules, and sometimes people just killed each other anyway, but that did lead to a decrease in the little petty fights going on. Well, the noblemen really liked all their petty fights. They liked killing each other for fun, and the only way to get cool was to defeat your enemies. So they had to figure out, how can I show how amazing I am and how buff I am, and how can I show how well I beat up all my enemies without actually killing anyone? So they said, well, let's do it make believe for fun. So they invented the tournament where everyone's going to fight and show off their skills and win fair lady. One of the most popular and enduring forms of competition at the tournament was the joust. Only knights were allowed to do the joust. Noblemen, the noblemen counted as knights because you needed to have a horse. So this is a joust. Whee! You have two people get in their horse and they armor up and they run at each other with heavy spears and try to knock each other off. Now, they don't have actual spears, they have a lance. A lance is different from a spear in that spears are either thrown or thrust. A lance is actually held against your body, and it usually has like a butt up against your body. So you're actually not thrusting it, you're just holding it still, and your horse is moving you so fast that's just the weight of the horse and rider pushing forward. And of course, for the tournament, you don't have a spearhead on it, although in war you would. In a tournament, they would have just a flat wooden end, or sometimes like a even wider wooden end, so it wouldn't kill the other guy when it hit him. They actually also had much thicker armor for tournaments than for actual battle. They would sometimes be like 50% thicker armor for these tournaments. Notice these bucket helmets they have with tiny, tiny little holes for the eyes. You probably couldn't wear something like that in battle because you couldn't see anything. Imagine only being able to see like this. You can't see anything. Well, for a tournament, you just have to go straight forward. For battle, you want a little more visibility. But the danger, there were two dangers really in the joust. One is just being knocked off your horse might break a leg or something. The horse, and the enemy horse might run over you. That's a problem. So they did eventually put a fence in between the two, so there's two different lanes. But yeah, being knocked off a horse at full gallop, wearing 100 pounds of armor, that could cause some damage. You hit your head on a rock or something, that's bad. The second danger is, quite often these lances would just shatter into a million pieces, and so there would be sticks flying everywhere, sharp splinters going everywhere, and if one of those got in your eye, that could be a problem. I believe there was a king of France who died after getting a giant splinter in his eye. And when I say splinter, I don't mean splinter, I mean like splinter. And during a tournament, the king died. If that gets in a chink in your armor, gets in your shoulder or something, and get infected, that's not good. Yep, rather dangerous. You would often have three chances to unseat your opponent, and you would get extra points for hitting them in the head. You would get so many points for hitting them in the shield. They have a very small shield, and that's really your main target. Extra points for hitting them in the head, and then lots of extra points for knocking them off their horse. Here's more tournament jousting. Notice how this helmet is actually like fluted up and out. So anything that hits there is going to be deflected far, far away. Notice also the itty bitty little shields they have. That's your target. Notice also that this guy's not riding a horse, he's riding a unicorn. What? The second main event, and there would be lots of events. There'd be archery, there'd be one-on-one sword fighting, there'd be one-on-one axe fighting, there'd be all sorts of different events. But the other main event would be the melee, and that's just where everyone divides into two teams and they just go at it and they just try killing each other. And they have blunted weapons, but you just have hundreds of people stuck in a tiny little area of the field just wailing on each other. And even if your swords aren't that sharp, if you're just whacking someone with a big metal stick, even through armor, could easily break a rib, break a bone. There's horses running crazy. If you get knocked off your horse and that horse in full battle armor is just galloping around the battlefield, that steps on your leg, you're in trouble. So the squires would be there, ready to get you a new horse or help you limp back off the field. And yeah, people died in the melee a lot. But that was one way to show honor. And there are multiple written accounts from these times where a king was in the middle of the melee and he sees someone doing an excellent job and he says, you know what, I want you to be at my side. And this nobody, minor nobleman, all of a sudden gets this huge promotion and gets the king's favor because he was super brave or whatever in the melee. Pretty cool. And crazy. I don't think we should bring that back. Target practice. That's what we should do.